Chapter 5. The next morning, Ling and Amelia were waiting for me in Reinhard's study. "Hi, man," he said. "Are you ready to start?" I opened my shoulder bag and took out my mini recorder, my laptop computer and 2 notebooks. "I've loaded Michael's manuscript onto a memory stick," Amelia said as she handed me a small, black object. "You could copy it onto your own computer, but then you would have to leave the laptop here each night. You've got my whole book on that?" Ling said to her. "We could get 100 books on it, Adam," said Amelia, and then she left the room. "That's the worst thing about my life," he said to me. "I don't know about things like this because everything's done for me." He shook his head, sadly. "And I never go into a shop, or carry any money. That's exactly the sort of thing we need to put into your book," I said excitedly. "Let's tell people what it really feels like to be Prime Minister." Readers are interested in the little things about another person's life, not politics. I pushed record on my mini recorder and my work began. "You weren't interested in politics when you were growing up," I said. "Is that right?" "Yes, that's right," said Ling. "I liked films and the theater, and I thought people who were interested in politics were strange. So what changed?" "What made you become interested?" I asked. "After I left Cambridge, I lived in a cheap little flat in London and worked in a bank," said Ling. "One wet Sunday afternoon, someone knocked on my door. I was still in bed because I'd been out very late the night before. But at last I opened the door and this beautiful girl was standing there. She started talking about the local election and I pretended that I was interested. I invited her in and made her a cup of tea. And as quick as that, I was in love. The girl was Ruth," I said. "Yes," he said. "And I knew that the best way to see her again was to go to the political meeting the next week and join the same political party. After that, we worked all morning. By the time we stopped for lunch we had talked about his childhood and had reached the part of his life when he was 17 and was hoping to become an actor." Ling left to play tennis with one of the security men and I went downstairs to the secretary's office where Lucy was typing. Earlier, I had asked her to be ready to type the interview up as we went along and she was working from the first recordings. Amelia was looking over Lucy's shoulder as the words appeared on the computer screen. "I've never heard him talk about any of this before," she said, as she read. I went through to the kitchen where there were some sandwiches waiting for me. After I had eaten I went outside and used my mobile phone to call Rick in New York. "We've had a good morning," I told him. Then I went back inside. It would be much easier to work on the book in my hotel room, I decided, and I'd had an idea. I went upstairs to the study and closed the door. I pushed Amelia's memory stick into my laptop, then connected my mobile phone to the computer. Next, I used my phone to connect to the internet and sent myself an email, with Mkara's manuscript attached to it. Just as I was finishing, I heard Amelia calling my name downstairs. I quickly went back into the sitting room and, after a minute, Amelia came in. "Where were you?" she asked. "I lost you. It's a big house," I said. She looked at me coldly. "It's not a good idea to go wandering around on your own. The security people don't like it." Amelia left the room and at that moment, Lang appeared. His face was red and he had a towel round his neck. "So, are you ready to get back to work?" I asked him. He looked angrily at me. "Work? You think what we're doing is work?" "Well, I certainly call it work," I said, sounding annoyed. After a moment, he grinned. "All right, man, let's do it." We went back to the study and talked about his family. His father had died when he was 16 and his mother had then become seriously ill. "How did your father die?" I asked. "He died of a heart attack, working in the garden," said Lang. "I found him after I came home from school." "That must have been terrible," I said. "And your mother?" "I was still a student at Cambridge when she died," he said. "Shall I tell you something? I saw 2 dead bodies when I was a teenager. But despite being Prime Minister and ordering men to fight in wars, it was 30 years before I saw another. And that was Michael Mkaris. Why didn't you send one of the security men to identify him?" I asked. I felt that I had to do it. For Michael. He paused, then said, "Let's talk about something different." "Okay, let's talk about Cambridge," I said. "You went there to study, but you also enjoyed acting." "I wasn't very good," he said. "But I joined the Footlights, the theater group." "But you were very good," I said. "People say that you could have become a professional actor." "Perhaps," he said. "But actors can't change things, only politicians can do that." He smiled at the memory. I loved it, going out on stage and pretending to be somebody else. What could be better? "That's good," I said. "We'll put that in the book." "No," he said, angrily. "The book is about a prime minister." All my political life my critics have accused me of being an actor. The day I announced I was going to retire as Prime Minister, one of the newspaper headlines was "Adam Lang leaves the stage." So we won't put in a lot about my time as a student actor. Leave it exactly the way that Michael wrote it. For some minutes, neither of us spoke. I was remembering Ruth Lang's words, "There's something not quite right with Adam at the moment and I'm a bit afraid to leave him." I was beginning to understand what she meant. Chapter 6. Amelia guessed that something was wrong when I took the next disc downstairs to Lucy. "What's happened?" she asked. "He seems nervous," I said. "He suddenly got very angry with me about nothing." She nodded. "There's something worrying him. He had a phone call just after you finished with him this morning." "Who from?" I asked. "It was on his mobile phone," she said. "He didn't tell me." "I wonder." She sat down in front of Lucy's computer and began to type quickly. After a few moments there was a report on the screen from a news website. 27th of January, 2:57 p.m. New York, Britain's ex-Foreign Secretary, Richard Reichart, has asked the International Criminal Court, the ICC, at The Hague to investigate the reports that ex-Prime Minister Adam Lang illegally gave orders for 4 British citizens to be given to the CIA for torture 5 years ago. Mr. Reichart, who was dismissed from Adam Lang's government 4 years ago, has passed various documents to the ICC. At that moment, telephones began ringing. Lucy reached for the phone on the desk. "Don't!" shouted Amelia. Then she said, more calmly, "It's the newspapers and we need to decide what to say. Switch off all the phones. Then check all the TV and radio news programs to see what else Reichart is saying." She looked at her watch. "Is Ruth still out walking?" "She is, isn't she?" She half ran from the room and I followed her. "Barry!" she called. One of the security men came out of the kitchen. "Barry, please find Mrs. Lang and get her back here," Amelia told him. Then we went upstairs to the study. Lang was sitting exactly where I had left him. "So, Reichardt's spoken to the papers, has he?" he said. "Why didn't you tell me?" said Amelia, annoyed. "I needed to tell Ruth first," he said. He looked at me. "Sorry I got angry earlier. Don't worry about it," I said. "What did Reichart say when you spoke to him?" asked Amelia. "He said that he felt he couldn't stay quiet about it any longer," said Lang. "He could have been recording the call, so I just said, 'Thank you for letting me know, Richard,' and hung up. We've switched off all the phones because we need to decide what we're going to say," said Amelia. Lang nodded. "Okay, what about this? Adam Lang says that when it was popular in the United Kingdom to support the American War on Terror, Mr. Reichart approved. When it became unpopular, he didn't approve. And when he was sacked from the Foreign Office, he decided to support suspected terrorists." End. Amelia was staring at him with pain in her eyes. He stared back at her with warmth in his. There was a moment of silence as they just looked at each other. And suddenly I knew that he loved her and that she loved him. Lucy came in with a piece of paper and Lang took it and began reading. A few moments later Ruth walked into the study. Lang finished reading and gave the paper to her. "The ICC will be giving a statement tomorrow," he said. "Oh, Adam!" cried Amelia. "Why didn't your friends at Downing Street warn us about this?" Ruth asked her. "The only reason you're here is so you can tell us about things like this. The ICC is very careful not to let a suspect know that they're investigating him," said Amelia. "They don't want them or the suspect's government to destroy any evidence." Her words seemed to shock Ruth. "So now Adam is a suspect, is he?" She turned to Lang. "You need a lawyer. Talk to Sid." She looked at Amelia again. "Get Sidney Kroll on the phone." "What about the newspapers and television people?" asked Lang. "Give them a simple statement, just a sentence or two," Ruth pointed at me. "He can do it. He's supposed to be the writer." "Wait a minute," I began. Amelia held up her hand for us to be quiet and spoke into the phone. "I have Adam Lang to speak to Sidney Kroll," she said. "No, he won't wait." I went downstairs with Lucy. She sat in front of her computer and waited for me to tell her what to say in Lang's statement. I suddenly realized that I hadn't asked Lang if he had ordered the kidnap of the 4 men. That was when I knew that he had, or he would simply have said that he hadn't when the story first appeared in the newspaper. "I have always supported the work of the International Criminal Court," I began, and Lucy started to type. "Had he? I didn't know." "I'm sure the ICC will realize that there is a political reason behind this hurtful story." I needed another line. "The international war on terror is too important to be used as one man's revenge against me." I took the typed statement up to the study, where Lang was talking to Sidney Kroll on the phone. I walked past Amelia and gave it to Ruth. She read it and nodded, then pushed it across the desk to Lang. He looked quickly at it, then pushed it back to me with a nod of approval. "Am I allowed to see it?" asked Amelia, as we went downstairs. I gave it to her and she read it. "Very good," she said. "You could be the new Michael Mkara." The telephones were switched on again and immediately began ringing. In the middle of all this noise, my own phone rang. It was John Maddox from Reinhardt in New York. "I've just heard the news," he said. "Get him to talk to you about it, but not to anyone else. We need to keep it just for the memoirs. Perhaps you should talk to Sidney Kroll," I suggested. Maybe Adam could say that his lawyers have told him not to talk. Good idea, said Maddox. We need to get this book published more quickly now that people are interested in Ling again. Are you saying that you want the book in less than a month? I asked. I know it's difficult, he said. It probably means using most of Mkar's manuscript, instead of rewriting all of it. But nobody's going to read most of that anyway. Can you do it in 2 weeks? No. Are you crazy? Was the right answer. Instead I said, I can try. I went to look for Amelia. She was standing outside the front of the house in the cold, winter darkness, smoking a cigarette. John Maddox just called, I said. He wants the book finished in 2 weeks. Good luck, she said. But don't expect to talk to Adam again today. Okay, I said. Then can someone take me back to my hotel? I'll do some work there. She looked at me. You're not planning to take the manuscript out of here, are you? Of course not, I said. All right, she said. I'll get one of the men to take you. She went back to the ringing telephones and I climbed the stairs to the study. As I got nearer, I heard Ruth and Adam shouting at each other. I didn't want to interrupt, but I knocked on the door. The shouting stopped and suddenly Ling said, "Come in." He was sitting at the large desk. His wife was at the other end of the room. I pointed towards my laptop and notebook. I wanted. Yes, all right, said Ling. Excuse me, Ruth said, pushing past me to get to the door. At that moment, Amelia appeared in the doorway, holding a telephone. Adam, it's the White House. The President of the United States wants to talk to you. She put her hand on my arm and gently pushed me towards the door. Excuse us, please. It was nearly dark when I got back to the hotel. I went up to my room and took my laptop from my bag. I used the hotel phone to connect to the internet and check my emails. Something was wrong. There were various messages, but the email with the manuscript that I had sent myself that afternoon wasn't there. I stared at the screen in shock. Had the security people removed it? Chapter 7. Early the next day I woke up to the sound of the telephone ringing. It was Amelia. Things have changed, she said. You need to leave your hotel immediately. There's already a car on its way to you. I pulled back the curtains that January morning and looked out at a sea and sky as gray as death. Below, 2 cars drove up and stopped outside the hotel. 2 men got out of the first car and one of them was holding a television camera. I got dressed, packed my suitcase and was downstairs by 8:45 am, an hour after the first ferry had arrived at Vineyard Haven. By that time, the lobby was full of newspaper and television reporters. I bought a newspaper and went into the hotel restaurant to read it. Lang was on the front page. Ex-Foreign Secretary says Adam Lang approved the use of torture by the CIA. The article said that the White House fully supports the ex-Prime Minister at this difficult time. But it was the last paragraph that made me forget to drink my coffee. Mr. Lang's memoirs will now be published at the end of April. John Maddox, of Reinhardt Publishing, said, "This is going to be a world publishing event. Adam Lang will be the first leader to give the real story about the war on terror." I went out through the lobby to the front of the hotel and telephoned Rick. He's not in the office. He's on holiday, I was told. The minivan took me out of Edgerton. As we got nearer to the forest, I could see a group of demonstrators at the side of the road. They saw the minivan and ran towards us. "Lying! Lying!" shouted a woman. "Liar! Liar!" The Edgerton police tried to get us through the crowd, but people were hitting and kicking the minivan. There was a man in the crowd being interviewed by a TV reporter. He turned and looked at the minivan and I thought he looked familiar. Then we were past and moving through the trees towards the house. Once I was back inside the house, Amelia took me to a bedroom at the back of the building. "It's Michael Carr's old room," she said. "I'm afraid his clothes are still in the wardrobe. We haven't had time to do anything with them yet. Isn't there another room that I could use?" I said. There was something about using a dead man's room that I didn't like. "There are only 6 bedrooms in the house," said Amelia. She looked at her watch. "Sidney Kroll will be arriving soon and the ICC will be making a statement in 30 minutes. Come up when you've unpacked your things." Kroll had flown in from Washington on a private jet, and when I got to the sitting room, Adam and Ruth Lang were sitting opposite him. Amelia and I sat down in chairs near them. The large TV on the wall showed a picture of the house. The cameraman taking the picture was in a helicopter. We could hear it in the sky outside. "I talked to John Maddox and he's right," said Kroll. "We really have to explain everything in the memoirs now." "It's the best way, Adam. What exactly are they planning to investigate me for?" asked Lang. "War crimes, probably," said Kroll, and there was a moment of silence. "The ICC can't bring American politicians to trial because America doesn't accept the ICC as a court of law. So instead, they're going to investigate one of America's closest friends, you, Adam. But I didn't order anyone to be kidnapped or tortured," said Lang. "Perhaps they could charge the United States with that, but not Great Britain. A person can be punished for helping to make it possible for someone else to do or try to do that, explained Grawl. And Reichert's given the ICC documents which show that Adam did help the CIA, said Ruth. Well, Adam's not in danger if he stays in America, said Grawl. Wait a minute, said Lang. Are you saying that I can't leave the United States? It's best that you don't travel to any country that accepts the International Criminal Court as a court of law. Yes, said Grawl. But that's nearly every country in the world, said Lang. Not America, said Grawl. Or China, Iraq, North Korea, Indonesia, Israel and some parts of Africa. I think something is happening, Amelia said suddenly, and she turned up the sound on the TV. And so we heard the ICC's chief prosecutor announce that Adam Lang was going to be investigated. Afterwards, the TV picture went back to the helicopter's view of Reinhardt's beach house. You should go to Washington immediately, Adam, said Grawl. Lang was still staring at the TV. We shouldn't have come here, he said. It looks as if we're hiding. I agree, said Grawl. We'll say that you're going to Washington for a meeting that was arranged weeks ago. I think that's a terrible idea, said Ruth. The British people will think Adam's running to the president for protection from the ICC. We should fly back to London. The British government will have to support you. You're wrong, said Amelia. Look. She pointed at the television. The words moving across the bottom of the screen read, British government to cooperate fully with war crimes investigation. And will they cooperate fully if the ICC arrest me? Asked Lang. They have to, said Grawl. Then I don't have a choice. I have to go to Washington, said Lang. I still think it will look bad, said Ruth. Not as bad as being arrested as I arrive in London, said Lang. But better than running away, said Ruth. So fly back without me, said Lang, angrily. I'll stay here, where people want me. Amelia, tell the security people we're leaving in 5 minutes. Get one of the girls to pack a bag for me. And you'd better pack one for yourself. Oh, why don't the two of you share a suitcase? Screamed Ruth. Silence. Then a red-faced Amelia picked up her notebook and walked quickly out of the room. Ruth waited until she had gone, then left without speaking. Lang sighed heavily and stood up. I'll see you tomorrow, he said to me. Grawl also stood up and then grinned at me. Happy ghosting, he said. Chapter 8. I watched the pictures on the television and saw that the Edgerton police were keeping the demonstrators on the opposite side of the road to the house. Suddenly, the Jaguar drove out through the gates. It stopped and Lang got out and went across to the TV cameras and reporters. "I'm sorry you've had to wait so long," he told them. "Lying! Lying!" came the shouts of the demonstrators. "Liar! Liar! I support the International Criminal Court," said Lang. "And I'm not afraid because I've done nothing wrong." He looked across at the demonstrators. "I'm traveling to Washington to continue with my work, but to everyone watching this in the United Kingdom let me say this. I shall always fight terrorism, even in the courts." Then he turned and walked back to his car. It was like watching a great actor, I thought. I went downstairs to my room. As I was passing one of the other bedrooms, I heard the sound of a woman crying. It was Ruth. There was a box file on my bed and a note that read, "Good luck, Amelia." I opened the box and saw Memoirs, by Adam Lang printed on the first page. I took the manuscript from the box, then took my laptop from my shoulder bag. Next I took out the typed pages from yesterday's interviews with Lang. After some minutes thinking, I took a deep breath and began to write. Chapter 1: Early years. I became a politician out of love. Love for a woman who came knocking at my door one wet Sunday afternoon. I looked out of the window and saw Ruth walking quickly towards the beach, her head down against the wind. Her security man was behind her. I watched her for a minute, then went back to work. At around lunchtime I stopped writing and stood up. Moments later, I found myself taking Mkara's clothes from the wardrobe and putting them on a chair. It suddenly seemed important to get everything of his out of that room. There was a big, old suitcase inside the wardrobe, so I took it out and opened it. It was empty except for a large, thick envelope addressed to Mkara with the words Adam Lang Papers, Cambridge on the front. I opened it and pulled out some photographs. There were a number of pictures of Lang when he was in the University Theatre group, the Footlights. There were also some newspaper reports about the elections in 1977 and Lang's first party membership card, which was dated 1975. 1975? That was 2 years earlier than the London elections. I started to look more carefully at the election reports then. In one picture there was a group of election volunteers and I could see Lang among them. So Lang had lied. He was pretending that he'd gone into politics because he'd fallen in love with a pretty girl. But he'd been a party member for 2 years by the time he met Ruth. Did it matter? Lang probably thought it made a better story. But Mkara must have had suspicions about the story. He had asked for these extra photos and papers to be sent and the story certainly wasn't in Lang's memoirs. And that surely wouldn't have pleased Lang. I looked again at the footlights photographs. One was a picture of 8 young people on a stage, 2 women and 6 men. Their names were on the back of the photo: G. W. Syme, W. K. Innes, A. Park, R. Emmett, A. D. Martin, E. D. Vaux, H. C. Martin, O. A. P. Lang. Under the names was a telephone number, probably written by Mkara. I hesitated for several moments, then dialed the number on my mobile phone. From the ringing sound, I realized it was an American number. A man answered. "Richard Reichart," he said. "Who is this?" He sounded suspicious. Shocked, I hung up immediately and dropped the phone onto the bed. After 30 seconds it began to ring. I picked it up and switched it off without answering it. Had Mkara written down the number? I couldn't be sure. I looked at the envelope to see when it had been sent. It had left the United Kingdom on 3rd January, 9 days before Mkara died. I put the photographs and newspaper election reports back into the envelope, pushed the package under the bed and went down to the kitchen. I ate a sandwich and took some time to think. Ruth hadn't arrived in London until 1976, when Lang was already a party member. So what had made him join the party? I knew now that it couldn't have been Ruth. So I'd spent half the morning writing about something that hadn't happened. Then I began thinking about Mkara and how he had died. Did he hit rocks, or was he thrown straight up onto soft sand? What was the name of the place where he'd been found? Lambert's Cove. It was about 16 kilometers away, according to a map I'd found at the house. Maybe I would go and have a look at it. The housekeeper told me that there were bicycles kept in the garage for guests to use. When I opened the garage door, I saw the Ford Escape SUV that Mkara had taken onto the ferry. For a moment or two I thought about using it instead, but I left it there and took a bicycle. When I got to the gate I saw that most of the demonstrators had gone. There was just one man left and I recognized him immediately. It was the man who had sworn at me in the hotel bar. He saw me and shouted, "Wait a minute!" But I didn't stop. The sky was dark with storm clouds and the wind was getting stronger. Most of the houses on the road down to Lambert's Cove were holiday homes and were closed up for the winter. After I had been cycling for about an hour, it started to rain so hard that I couldn't see where I was going. I left the bicycle by a gate and ran up to the veranda of what I thought was an empty house. But a moment later the door opened and an old man with thin, white hair looked out. I started to say that I was sorry to disturb him, when he said, "That's okay, You can shelter from the rain. Are you British? Yes, I said. So what are you doing in this part of the island? He asked. I'm going to Lambert's Cove, I said. I knew the man who fell off the ferry. That was a strange thing, he said. The sea would never have brought that guy this far west at this time of year. I turned to look at him. Really? I said. Did you tell that to the police? Young man, he said. At my age I have better things to do with my time. But I did tell Annabeth Wormbrand. It was she who told the police about the lights. The lights? I said. The lights the night the body appeared on the beach, he said. What sort of lights? I asked. Flashlights, I suppose, he said. Moving around on the beach. The newspapers and TV didn't report anything about flashlights, I said. That's because Annabeth has never spoken to a reporter in her life, he said. Can you tell me how to find her house? I asked. Sure. But she's not there, she's in hospital, he said. She fell downstairs 2 weeks ago and she's in a coma. The doctors say she'll never wake up again. I stared at him, suddenly feeling sick. Then I said, thanks for letting me shelter on your veranda. I turned and ran towards my bicycle. Hey! He shouted. But I didn't look back. About half a kilometer further down the road near the beach, there was a big, low house. There were no lights on inside it and I guessed that this was Annabeth Wormbrand's home. Could it be true? Had she seen lights? It would certainly be possible to see the beach from the upstairs windows. I cycled down to the beach. The sound of the crashing waves was very loud now. I thought about Mkara, alone and face down in the sand, his clothes full of water. I imagined his body being thrown from a small boat and pulled up the beach by men with torches. And then I imagined those same men coming back a few days later to throw Annabeth Wormbrand down her stairs. Some distance along the beach, 2 people were walking towards me. The tall one was a man, the short one a woman. After a minute, I saw that the woman was Ruth Lang. At first, the noise of the wind and sea made it impossible to hear her until they got nearer. What are you doing? She shouted. The housekeeper told me you had come here. I wanted to see the place where Mkara was found, I shouted back. Why? You didn't know him. I was curious, I replied. We've come to fetch you back before the storm gets worse. She turned and shouted at the security man with her. Barry, bring the minivan round and meet us on the road. We'll bring the bicycle up and find you. I can't do that, Mrs. Lang, he shouted back. I have to stay with you all the time. Don't be stupid. she shouted. There are no terrorists here. Go and get the van. He didn't look happy, but he turned and began to run back the way that they had come. Ruth and I walked up towards the road. I've come here once or twice myself, she said when we were away from the noise of the sea. I usually bring a few flowers. Poor man. She stopped and looked at me. Do you think Michael's death was suspicious? She asked. I'm not sure, I said. I was surprised by the question, but stopped myself telling her about the old man or about Annabeth Wurmbrand. This was not the time or the place, so instead I asked, why was Mkara on the ferry? I don't know, she said. We walked on silently. Suddenly, I had a thought. Had Mkara left the island to visit Richard Reichard in New York? That would explain Reichard's telephone number on the back of the photograph and why he hadn't told the Lings where he was going. Barry was waiting for us on the road. We put the bicycle in the back of the van, then I sat next to Ruth on the journey back to the house. She didn't speak, but she did something unexpected. She put her cold hand in mine,